And I also want to thank a lot of my old friends who are out here tonight. A lot of us are old comrades in the struggle, and I know it's like way past your bedtime. So we'll try to get the show going now. Our first presenter is Carolyn Maylin Marr, and she is a fabulous poet. You're going to hear it for yourself. She's a high school teacher. She graduated with a Master's of Fine Arts from Warren Wilson College. She's part of the Rabo Collective. Some of her writings are in the journal over there at Calyx, and also she's been published in Cimarron Review and New England Review. But the reason why I really wanted Carolyn to be up here tonight is poetry has this power to kind of unlock a window into first the mind of the poet, how the poet is feeling, but really good poetry triggers whole waves of emotion in your own head, and it brings you to places that you've been to in the past, places you want to go to in the future. That's really the power of poetry. And I know there are other poets in the audience tonight. I hope we can do more programs with poets and music, but right now I want you to meet Carolyn Maylin Marr.
Hi, all. Thanks. I'm Carrie, and I want to start with some gratitude. I'm a high school teacher, I had to. I want to start with some gratitude. I want to thank Eddie Wong and Eastwind Ezine for putting this event together and inviting me to be part of it. I want to thank Charlie Chin, who's going to be performing next, and my ancestors and all of the Gumsan ancestors for making what must have been a pretty overwhelming journey to get here. I also want to do a special acknowledgement to the fact that tonight we're sitting in occupied Ohlone territory, specifically Chochenyo Ohlone in what's now known as Oakland. This land, the Bay Area, is my home, and while I'm grateful for it, I recognize that my notions of home come at a pretty high price, which is settler colonialism. And I just want to recognize that the Ohlone were and are still here. And on that same note, I also want to acknowledge and thank the ancestors and current members of the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California, the indigenous inhabitants of the Lake Tahoe Basin, and especially the Washoe Cultural Resource Advisory Council for their support and collaboration on some of my work. And of course, thank you to all of you for being here tonight, and to Eastside Cultural Center. So tonight I'm going to read 6 poems, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and my process in between. All of this work is connected to a second book manuscript that I'm currently working on, which is a collection of poems that explores questions of inheritance, colonization, language, family, and nature. And the focal points of the narrative are the landscape of Lake Tahoe and the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad, mostly by Chinese labor, in the 1860s. And this first poem I'm going to read was inspired by a line in a book about Lake Tahoe, which is the epigraph of the poem. Tragedy. One of the Chinese had been skewered by an iron brake rod and was screaming for somebody to shoot him. E.B. Scott, The Saga of Lake Tahoe. I think of the white man who lived after an iron rod, also from the railroad, also a brake rod, perhaps, speared him right through his brain. Medical marvel. The conflicting accounts of whether or not the injury caused personality change. Early neurology, psychology, his daguerreotype affixed in the gilt-framed textbooks of our memory. It is unclear whether the Chinese was or was not shot. Whether he survived was too a marvel with a hole in his gut, or was it? No, had to be gut. To skewer is to be food, gutted. The screaming implies not lungs nor throat. And the heart, well, death already. I have screamed for somebody to let me die, but no one had a gun. I was asking not to be saved, Oh, girl child, sadness, epigenetic thread, disappointment stitched to every story. In a different book, I read that the Chinese had gunpowder hundreds of years before we put it to guns. The Maya with wheels, the author's comparison. When a tool's not worth the change it rings. All fireworks, no grenades, firecrackers without the cracking of bullet, just crush of knuckle to bone, iron to rib. What interested the teller in this story was not the story's inevitable end, a body, dead one way or another, bones shipped home for burial, a pallet box, or my father coming home through customs. What you got in that suitcase, son? My grandmother, he chuckles with each retelling. We visit her every year, one of 6 names on a stone. The index, too, lists 6 mentions of the Chinese in 468 pages. Caroline is the name of a boat, one of 162 indexed. Home is where your living will honor you as long as they remember you, a mean old woman. A skewering tongue in my father's childhood, bitterness. Either way, I know the man in the story is dead. Crawl of infection, loss of blood, shouting recoil of mercy. Somebody's. It's been too long for a miracle. The water is meant for the rush of the hull. It doesn't count each dive. 144 years, waiting for someone to call his name. Thanks, y'all. So, as I started writing these poems, one challenge that came up was translation. I've always used a lot of vernacular speech and multiple languages in my poetry because I'm interested in having my speakers use language in ways that make their identities, whether racial, cultural, gender, sexual, ethnic, linguistic, and so on, visible on the page. But now I want to use languages other than English without always translating for my presumably English-speaking reader. And the problem with that is I'm a really lousy Cantonese speaker. And I'm functionally illiterate in Chinese. So I went to immersion elementary school, and then I had Chinese tutors until I was 18, and I spent a few months in Hong Kong studying when I was in my 20s, and I rarely use Cantonese. Basically, I only use it to order food. Yeah, much English speakers. And I never read it. So when I came across this term water guest in Jean Felser's book, Driven Out, I knew the English translation only as she presented it. Water guests were the people who carried letters back and forth between California and China. The term was so beautiful, and it also felt like this in-between identity that I wanted to explore. And I knew already the translation for water, so I could even write it. It's like a second grade word. But I'd never used the word guest in my entire broken Cantonese speaking life. And unfortunately, my dad's Chinatown street Cantonese, also illiterate, sorry Dad, not so helpful. So, Google. Now I know the character for guest, it's that second one. But Google is Google and Mandarin hegemony. So I ended up writing 3 poems about my journey to try to fucking figure out how to pronounce this second character, this word for guest, and this word that was like a mystery to me, even as its meaning was known. So this next poem is one of those 3. It contains a fair amount of untranslated Cantonese, so if you're not a Cantonese speaker, just enjoy the sounds. And if you are a Cantonese speaker, I'm sorry about my accent, and I hope you get the joke that I snuck in here. Guest, second translation. Months later, I will ride down the wide boulevards of my city with 2 strangers and a driver, the age of my father, same receding black hair, but lacking the milk-tall stance and orthodontia smile of the American-born, thus reminding me more of the generation before. The strangers don't speak, staring at their phones. as is the custom. I stare at his name, turning its tone in my closed mouth. It could be Chi or even Chi, but who would name their child Chi, really? I won't speak until the strangers both leave the car, mouth careful. My father grew up in Chinatown, and how long have you lived here, Chi? Deciding to go for tone 1 like an optimistic song on my tongue, and he asks me, do I speak Guangdonghua? And I say Mo Gam Do, and he says he thinks it's better living in the Richmond than crowded Chinatown. And yes, the Richmond is a lot like the Sunset where I grew up, which is when it occurs. Maybe he can answer. So at the next red light, I pull up my ghost words and say, I know, sorry, but I don't know this second one. Can you help me? And he says, oh yes, his silver bridge flashing, delight at the shore of his lip. That soy hak means someone who travels back and forth like a merchant or an importer-exporter. Says it a few times for me to practice in my wobbly hak, hak, hak accent until I get it right. Hak. I say it used to mean the people who carried your letters home when no one could leave or come here. And he says, sure, it's still a lot like that. They still use it for those who go back and forth between here and there, carrying what anyone needs. So another place where I got curious about untranslation was with Washu, the language of the Washoe tribe. As I researched and wrote about Tahoe, I knew I had to include stories that went beyond white colonization of the lake, beyond the capitalism of the lake's current structure, although that certainly comes up too. Thanks to some family inheritance, my wife and I are able to own a home in Lake Tahoe, which is really magical and restorative and lucky, and also like deep participation in leisure capitalism. So this next poem references one of Tahoe's most famous ski resorts, the place where they held the 1960 Winter Olympics, whose name contains a derogatory term for Native American women. The poem also contains a Washoe term, which might be the original name for this valley and means the place where the deer run. Thanks to Joanne Nevers for recalling this possible name, and to Herman Fillmore, Culture and Language Resources Director of the Washoe Tribe, for the orthography. The title of the poem is the name of that ski resort, just bleeped out. S Valley. The trail winds down the mountain's side, tree line hiding what might kill you. Ice crevice, creek not quite gone cold enough to freeze, or another tree, solid as a wall you can smash a body against. You knew a boy who smashed like that, popped his collarbone clean into, helicoptered home. Another popped his truck into a tree, wheel bent and beer bottled as he tumbled onto asphalt, still living. What kind of boy was it, you wonder, who climbed this gorgeous ridge and thought, I ought to name this valley. I ought to name whatever comes into my line of sight, call it after a woman like I call everything I've ever owned, she and her. A boy in uniform, a boy who didn't think of what might already have been named. When you were young, you loved a boy who put his fist into a wall. You understood boys might someday want to put their fists into your body, breakable, what they were raised to be. Comfort them, be the woman who can tend their busted down beds of need. A woman teaching them how to be better, what to tender, what not to break. Oh, what an old and boring story. You'll have to dig to ask around, but you'll find it. This valley's name might be Memdui Itmush, might be no one remembers for sure. You know how to learn what you can. You knew to run off like a deer, be a body of your own, riding down the ridge, not raising the next line of boys, not when some other mother's boy might stride across some mountain, look you in your face, call you a name you know is not what you are called. So, thanks, y'all. So one winter Sunday, 4 years ago, I had to take the train home because there was a really big storm coming. We were going to get snowed in, and being a very responsible high school teacher, I could not miss Monday classes. So my wife, Sandy, drove me the half hour to the Truckee train station, and I took the train home in the storm. It was really stunning, of course, and it also made me realize that I'd never taken the train along this route that our community's ancestors, and at least one of my own ancestors, had built. So my great-grandfather, Mar Dunn, worked on the railroad, and my great-great-grandfather, Wong Lok, was also working in California in the same time period. So about 3 years ago, I started writing this letter poem to the two of them, whose names I didn't actually know at the time, and both of whom I was pretty sure worked on the railroad, although now I know that's probably not the case. So the poem sort of grew into this massive thing. It's 15 pages long, and it's the center of this book manuscript. Okay, ready? Just kidding. I'm only going to read a few excerpts. I'm not going to read 15 pages. That's crazy. The title, Cantonese, translates to great-great-grandfather, who is my paternal grandmother's grandfather. And then there's another name, which is great-grandfather, who is my paternal grandfather's father, respectively. You know, Chinese people will be, ooh, oops. Oh, no. Well, we're real obsessed with lineage titling. It's our own, like, patriarchal bullshit. And the line, the mountains are calling. There's a line that starts, the mountains are calling. That's a John Muir quote. Okay. Go Zhoufu, a correspondence, Taiye. I have no one left to ask here, so I write to ask you these things. Did you ever see this lake? Were you one of those who scaled that nearby pass? As you looked across this gorgeous landscape, all granite, all tall pine, all blue air, tell me what you thought. Did you hate the mountains for the work, arm swing, pick swing, hammer swing, shovel swing, they wrung out of you? Would it be so bad if these mountains were your eternity, the thinner air of heaven? The mountains are calling, and I must go. The blue like a lance to your heart. Blue the basin, the basket, the berry, the juice, blue that counters the yellow of bleach, bluing, blue indigo, blue dye number 4, blue the bruise, the bitter, blue anything but an eye, please, blue the water, the wash, the vein in my body, the vein in my earth, our earth, the sapphire blue, the glittering dark sky at night, sky at day, sky at blue notes sounding, blue the print, the plan, the next step into blue, the brazen, the bold, the navy, the few, the proud, who wants that blues? Sing it again, sister, bluer than blue, my blue blood, true blood, TV, fantasy, blue light, blue screen, blue movie, blue balls, blue butch, blue, black, battered and beaten, or blue like a piece of glass with the sun shining through it, blue as a shard, a shatter, a splatter of water, blue blur that won't leave me, don't sparkle for just anything, don't break. Let's not pretend you would have cared what happened to me, except I am your dream of Gamsan made real. My rings of gold, my dress of gold, my eyes of gold, my skin of gold, my mouth, my mouth, my mouth. Of late, no, since I was a child, I've spent a lot of time wondering about the bachelor society. What secrecy that invites, all those bodies, men and male, kept close in their togetherness. I read only silence. Did a Soihak carry your letters for you? I, too, would be a guest in your house, a guest made of water, a guest in every house on this land that shouldn't belong to me. tiger balm smell of mama's sore knees. I imagine your knees after each day's labor. Your shoulders ache. Each body's work takes a different weight. Who was the one who rubbed the knots, who laid a sweet and gentle palm, though rough like yours, against your tender hurts? Tell me about him, who loved you best, who you hid, who hid you. Was it your lips to your lips pressed in those claustrophobic kindling rooms? In Hong Kong, I was shy to speak to the other women. I have a girlfriend, too, finally, then laughter. A culture of women away from family and homeland, awash in women's work and the ways it buckled them, but still, a kind of relief. You're teaching me the beauty of revisionist history. I make you lovers because, yes, it is in my power, because my ancestral altar needs a queerer root, because, too, I am afraid of the smoke-thick danger of you if you were not. Girl children in locked cages. Who could love a man like that? Gold is the eye, the tongue, the lion. Gold the mountain, the valley, the river. Gold the nugget, the ingot, the flake, the flume, the fairy, the dust, the feather, the fatherland. Gold the sun and the sunlight, the sun. You wanted sons and sons and sons. Gold the daughter in spite of. Gold the bangles and bracelets and rings. Gold the ornate and elaborate. Hold me here. This is my ordinary hand. Because only barbarians touch like that. I am free to build you in my own image. Your mouth on another man's mouth, unafraid or maybe afraid, quiet in a boarding house bed or a canvas tent, the hurried rush of your bodies before shift change or exhaustion or the call to supper, the joy of it. I'd rather not be gold-dusted shimmer of bronzers and glimmering lotions, potions of nanoparticles that never break down and will float forever in this water, in the gut of a fish, in my blood. No. Tell me about blue, about how you shouted and shuddered when your feet touched the water each time you bathed in the cold spring air. So I have two more poems to read. This next one addresses the reason that I had to do so much secondary research on the Chinese history in the region, and also why I've had to invent my own ancestors' stories. And that invention is a kind of freedom, but it's also a kind of heartbreak, right, to not know their stories. One thing that I want to make clear that I learned from historian Gordon Chang, great book, you should all read it, is that railroad laborers at this time were definitely writing, probably extensively. There are railroad company order records for inkstones and calligraphy brushes and paper and all these things. Soihaks were carrying letters on ships in both directions, but in the western U.S., almost every Chinese settlement in Chinatown was burned down, some of them multiple times, by xenophobic white settlers. And in China, migration, wars, the Cultural Revolution severed a lot of ties between families and their artifacts. So this next poem is the result of these historical events. Catalog of writings left by Chinese railroad laborers of the CPRR. And my final poem tonight is going to be a return to that term, Soihak, that I spoke to you about earlier. This poem was recently published in Volume 30, Issue 1 of the print journal Calyx, which is going to be for sale over on that table. Soihak, The water, a guest inside of us, salty, sweet, and swimming, how water does. And you, a guest in your own house, a watery word, a guest on the tongue, a gust of air across wet lips, a voice echoing back and back, though nothing's left to prove it, no papers, no shred of evidence, not one letter, not one mark upon the page, no papers, your papers, for a period of 3 long years, an ocean away from where you are not a guest. Where are you from? People ask me, ask people who look like me, look like anything but the blankness of a page. Let me turn then to the color of water into ink ground against a stone, the words carried back by each water guest, each bringer of news and love and tribulation. Here are the words that belong to you. Here are the words that belong. Thank you.